climbing on Roger Lee's shoulders. So, Antoine, when you want.
Yes. So this meeting being recorded, right? Yes. So thank you very much. And good morning or good afternoon. I'm not sure. I think most people are probably in Europe, so probably good morning. So what I'd like to talk about is something that it's not one particular paper where I would go into the very tricky details, but it's more of a, let's say, collection of papers over the past few years. So some of it, some of you might have already seen it, but it kind of builds on things that we've been doing over the past few years and opening future routes for the next couple of years. And the big umbrella part is basically, as we'll see in the next few slides, that we start from data. So we start, let's say we look at the S&P 500, I look at European options on the S&P, I look at this data, and the question is, what kind of information can I extract from it? In particular, can I extract information about the underlying process? And we'll see that we have been building over the past few years a certain number of tools that allow us to actually extract some kind of information, not full information, but some kind of information. And this is what we're going to go through. So as you can see at the bottom, it says based on, usually that's where you list your co-authors, but in fact, because it's based on things with many people, I need a bigger slide to put all the names. So I will, it's not that I want to forget anybody, but I'll mention the names when it comes to it. All right, and so the subtitle, as you can see, is climbing on Roger Lee's shoulders. We'll see why exactly, but essentially it's because, in my view, the first paper really looking at that kind of problem in a really rigorous way was by Roger Lee from 15 years ago. And essentially you can view those slides, this presentation, as basically trying to tweak his formula, to tweak his result in every possible direction and try to extend it. And we will try, at least as much as possible, to remain in a completely model-free setting. So this is not entirely true for the whole talk, but most of it, I will not assume that I have a process. I will not assume that I have a particular stochastic volatility or rough volatility or anything, because I actually want to be able to extract that kind of information from the data. And okay, so this first slide, so is it just making sure that everybody can see it properly? But
yes.
Okay, so this first slide, there's nothing very exciting about it. It's really merely to set the notations, because every paper, everyone has different notations on that. So just to make sure we're on the same page. So for me, S is the underlying process. So think of the S&P 500. Big X is the log stock price, and I normalize everything. So there's no dividend, no rates. S0 starts at 1. It doesn't really change anything, at least for the purpose of our results, but it just makes all the notation simpler. Black shows, so I will write black as always, well, always. So the parameter is a little x, which is the log moneyness. Or if you want to incorporate rates, that would be the log forward moneyness. Sigma is the volatility parameter, and capital T is the maturity. And in fact, we know that even though it depends on 3 parameters, in fact, it really depends on 2, x, and sigma root T coming together. And my funny calligraphic with D is what people call either D2 or D minus, right? Which depends on X and sigma root T. And the implied vol, as we know, is for each log moneyness and each maturity is the volatility parameter that allows me to match an observed price. Okay, so I is my implied volatility, but in fact, very often it turns out it's more convenient. So one thing, sorry, I should say, is my implied volatility, meaning I is not sigma, right? I is sigma root t. And my total implied variance, W, is sigma root t squared, right? So it would just be sigma squared t, but this is actually a better object to look at for reasons we'll discuss later. And I have a slight abuse of notation, just at least for the sake of the slides. I may write BS of I or BS of W, but it's usually clear from the context. Okay, so this is really to set the notations and to make sure we understand what we're talking about. But before looking at any other formulae, just want to look at 4 pictures, just to try and understand what we're actually trying to achieve here. So these are European options on the S&P 500. So these are not the options, that are the implied volatility that I retrieved directly from the CBOE, the Chicago Board of Options Exchange. So at the top, this is 7th of January 2020. I could have taken earlier dates, but I did it a bit randomly there. 7th of January 2020. At the bottom, so let's just look at the top one first. So this is 1 day, and I have a maturity of 10 days, maturity of 45 days, right? So 2 weeks roughly, and a couple of months, a month and a half, 2 months. So I plot here the log moneyness, right? So the little x. And what do I observe? Well, first of all, there are actually loads of things to say about these graphs. So, but the important thing is when maturity changes, obviously the smiles, so the implied volatility changes. So I can't have a model, say Black-Scholes, where the implied volatility will not change, but I have volatility changes with maturity. I also have, of course, the smile, right, which means the volatility is now flat, but I have this concavity feature. I also have, this is more intriguing, you might say, that so the red is the put implied volatility, meaning the implied volatility retrieved from puts, and the blue one is the call implied vol. The two are not the same. So in principle, in theory, they should be the same, right? Because we have blue call parity, but in fact, data, as we know, data are not clean. There are issues, and if you want to look at this more properly, that would be a completely different talk, because of course, in those regions for very large or very small strikes, liquidity is an issue, so not everything is quoted. So there is, if you really want to do the numerics and test things, you have to take these things into account. When you are close to the money or not too far here, I have high liquidity, so I have basically blue call parity is not too much of a problem. So all calls are traded, puts are traded, and so the implied volatility, I can compute it from both. Otherwise, I may have large discrepancies. So I will not really talk about this issue here, but this is just to keep in mind. So that's one feature. The second feature is now I move here, which is I go from 7th of January to 8th of January. And the smiles are not the same. Well, you can try to look very closely. You can also, that's the easier solution, at least for now, is to trust me, they're not the same. What does that mean? It means that from one day to the next, the smile or the volatility surface, right, so as a function of x and maturity, changes. So if you want to build a model that is consistent with all that data, well, you need first to say, okay, if I observe at some time little t, say little t is 7th of January, I want to build the surface in little x and capital T that fit the data, that is arbitrage free, and so on. But the next step, which is actually a lot harder, as we'll see, is can I make the surface move in time, in little t? And in time meaning stochastically, and this is much harder. So this is essentially what we're going to try and look at. So given these smiles, can I say, so the obvious questions would be, okay, these prices, or these implied volatilities, are generated from the dynamics of the S&P and traders buying and selling calls and puts. Is the underlying S a true martingale? Does it have default probability? And well, at least these two questions. And how do I price other options based on these calls and puts? So these are the essential questions we want to try and answer. Okay, so let's. This is even more data. If you look at other days, right? So this was in August, and you go further, then this was to illustrate again some liquidity issues. That's not all calls and puts are traded. Okay, so this is to summarize and essentially what I said, which is if you really look at data, you first have to clean the data, and this is usually a pain, but it's fundamental. And so the first question we want to look at is this, which is, can I find a map? So I, if you think in terms of implied vol, or W, if you think in terms of total implied variance, that fits the data. So that fits, let's say for each little t, that fits the data in X and in capital T, and that does not generate any arbitrage. Okay, so let's look at the first part. So first of all, what do I mean by no arbitrage? So the first step is not to look at the implied vol, but to first look at call prices. And you have a certain number of conditions, the sufficient conditions, and essentially what they say is, if I take a function or a map C, so the first argument is strike and K, and the second argument is maturity. So I may, depending on what I'm looking at, I may think in terms of K, which is the real strike, and little x, which is the log one, and it's really convenient. Some expressions are easier with K, some are easier with X. So as a function of strike for each T, the call price has to be convex and decreasing. As a function of maturity, the call price is increasing. When strike tend to infinity, no matter what the maturity is, the prices tend to zero. I have some no arbitrage bounds, and I recover the payoff at maturity. If you have these 5 conditions, then you know that there exists a non-negative Markov martingale such that these prices, all C of K and T, are generated exactly by this martingale process. So that's convenient. There's a standard counterexample, a strict local martingale, which we'll get back to later, where some of the bounds might be violated. There's just a quick
Sorry, Jack.
Yeah.
A question. So this model, this counterexample, is a kind of constant elasticity variance model, not? Do you mean that there is arbitrage here?
It's a strict local martingale, right? So it's in a sense that, you know, if so it violates this one, right? Because if I look at K is equal to 0, C0T should be between little s, so the little s is S0 and S0, right? But in fact, it's strictly less than S0. It's a strict local martingale.
So do you mean that here there is arbitrage?
What I'm saying is that, so, okay, I don't want to go into the, or the no free lunch with vanishing. And what I'm saying is it violates one of the conditions. And in particular, it means that, which makes sense, right? Because S is not a non-negative Markov Martingale.
Okay.
So what I mean here by arbitrage-free call price is really these 5 conditions.
Okay,
so
thanks.
The only reason why I don't want to answer your question in the sense that the arbitrage or no arbitrage is because I don't want to go into no free lunch with vanishing risk and all that, where you change the admissible strategies and so on. But in my view here, these are the 5 conditions that define arbitrage freeness. So in this context, yes, it creates an arbitrage because it's a strict local model.
Thanks.
And a quick note that is important is this is an existence-only result, right? The theorem says that there exists a non-negative Markov Martingale, but it doesn't say absolutely anything about the actual path behavior of this. It's only an existence result. I don't know actually how to construct it, and I don't know much of its properties. Okay, so as I said, I want to think in terms of implied vol rather than call prices. The reason is, well, first, because people actually quote implied vol rather than call prices. It's a more natural object to look at, and also because the conditions, the 5 conditions we saw earlier, are actually easier to manipulate at the implied vol level. And this is what this theorem does, which is basically to translate these conditions into conditions on W, which is the total implied variance, right? So sigma squared times T, if you wish. And the conditions are, so I'm not going to go through all of them in detail. The important ones are the last 2, right? So, call prices have to be increasing in maturity, meaning that W also has to be increasing. So I'm a bit loose here when I say increasing, I mean non-decreasing, right? But this is for the sake of the talk. So that's calendar spread, right? Which makes sense because as maturity increases, you have more uncertainty, so the vol increases. And the tricky one is the so-called butterfly, which is basically translating the fact that the call price has to be convex in strike, and you translate that into W, into the implied vol. The proof is really simple. The proof is just saying the call price is Black-Scholes evaluated in a W. You want the call price to be convex, so you take second derivative on both sides, and everything has to be positive. And you end up with what? You end up with this expression being positive. So the problem is with this expression is, as you can see, it's highly nonlinear, and it depends on W, on its first derivative and its second derivative. Meaning what? Meaning that in general, if you give me a function W, I can check it for each x and t, but it's hard to find precise conditions on W to satisfy this function. So as I said, this function g comes in naturally when you just differentiate call prices, but in fact, you can also, that's a different way of thinking about it. If you look at the density of the stock price, so little p, this is, you can write it explicitly as some exponential of something. No, I don't care too much about, over square root of 2 pi, and then you have the function g. So if you want it to be a genuine density, at least it has to be positive. Of course, it has to integrate to 1, but this is a slightly different condition. So this is basically what we want to check, at least. And the oldest, one of the oldest, there's a slight debate on, but back in the early 2000s, Jim Gathro, when he was at Merrill Lynch, basically proposed a function W only of log moneyness, only of x. So I added a t because t is part of the option contract, but in fact, W itself does not depend on t, and you have a different W for each capital T, but it's a function of 5 parameters, A, B, rho, and psi. Right, so A, B, rho, M, and psi. And it has been used a lot. Why? Simply because it's easy to calibrate, right? If I have a smile calibrating, this function is easy, and it actually fits pretty well. The problem is, can I check for arbitrage? Essentially, how do I do this? Well, I'll plug W into this formula for G, and I'll check. So once I have A, B, O, Xi, it's easy to do. Now, can I find conditions on A, B, O, Xi such that G is positive? The answer is very hard. And I think the latest advance there is this recent preprint by Claude Martini and Ariana Mingone, which describes a set of sufficient and almost necessary conditions, but it's far from explicit, and it's quite intricate to really get simple conditions. But it's still used quite a lot in practice, this formula. But as I said, this is for each capital T, you have a smile. You have a smile parameterization. You can do a little bit better, which is to say, I'm not going to look at for each capital T, but I'm going to look at the whole surface. So the question is, can I find a function W of X and capital T that is arbitrage free, meaning essentially no calendar spread arbitrage and no butterfly arbitrage, and that hopefully also fits the data. So the answer to the first question is yes, it's possible, and this is one such function. I'm not claiming it's the only one, but that's at least the only one we found, where it looks a bit like SVI. So SVI stands for stochastic volatility inspired, and so SSVI is the first S is for surface. It looks similar, and now the parameters, I have a theta, which depends on capital T, which is basically the at the money point, which you can actually retrieve from market data, and then I have a kind of backbone function phi, which I'm able to specify, where I do have some flexibility. And the point is that with this function, with this family of function, if you wish, through phi, we are able to show that this is free of calendar spread arbitrage and butterfly arbitrage. I'm not writing the exact conditions, but we have a theorem that states precise condition ensuring this. And so we have examples of such functions that prevent arbitrage and actually fit the data pretty well. So this we did a couple of years ago. There's actually something I'm working on these days, which I find quite interesting, which is related. So for whoever in the audience likes optimal transport, so this is related to which is Martingale optimal transport, which is, suppose you take two maturities T1 and T2, right? So let's say 1 year, 2 years. I observe all the call and let's say all the calls and puts were, well, let's say all the calls, right? So I observe all the call options maturing at T2, all the call options maturing at T1, which is equivalent to observing the distribution of the stock price at T1 and distribution of stock price at T2. Now, SSVI, because SSVI depends on capital T, well, not only suppose that it's not only gives you a way to interpolate between T1 and T2, right? So I can get every maturity between T1 and T2, right? Because I can take any T within this interval. So it gives me a way to interpolate the surface between these two maturities. But now you could ask, well, this is exactly what optimal transport is trying to do, right? Optimal transport says I have a distribution at time one, at time two. How do I construct a process or properties of a process going from time one to time two? And there's, in particular, there's this concept of displacement interpolant. So this map rule, which is which maps a measure mu1 to a measure mu2, where this sharp is just a push forward of a measure. So this is simply a linear interpolation in time. So U is time, and there's a little typo because yes, so this is a little typo, sorry, because in principle is between 0 and 1, so that would be 1 minus U plus U, but okay, I interpolated between 1 and 2. Okay, but so I have a linear interpolation in time here, which transports my two measures. But again, this SSVI is a very particular type of interpolation. The question is, does that correspond actually to to one of these displacement interpolants that are actually popular in optimal transport literature? So this is something we're looking at, because if you can do this, then if you can get properties of such displacement interpolant, then you might be able to retrieve information about the process itself. And you might be able to apply actually many optimal transport tools to obtain arbitrage-free bounds for more exotic options. So this is something that's very much in progress. And to try and understand SSVI in the context, more general context of optimal transport. Okay, so this was really, we are today and we're observing the surface. Now, as we saw, if I move to tomorrow, the surface has changed. So how do I take that into account, and how do I build a model that will move the surface from today to tomorrow? So now I'm going to write slightly different, which is this map, right? So now capital T is fixed, right? I fix a maturity, let's say 1 year, and I'm going to look at the surface moving. So now in little t, right, little t goes from 0 to time capital T, meaning that the actual remaining maturity decreases, right? Because you're getting closer to the maturity. And in fact, the log moneyness, which is log x, which is log of k, what used to be log of k over S0, now is log of k over ST, right? Because the time at which you look at the surface evolves in time. And I'm going to drop the capital T dependence, because otherwise it becomes really ugly. And so what we're assuming is that our surface at each little t, at each time little t, at each running time little t, all the way to maturity, has this form, which is what? Which is exactly SSVI, but in the case where there's no correlation. So you might say, well, on equity, this is clearly not true, which I agree with. You might counter argue that on FX, mines are rather symmetric, so it's not too bad, but the point was to actually start from somewhere where we can actually do some computations. And because we know that this uncorrelated SSVI is arbitrage-free. That's the theorem we had before. So we're assuming that at every point in time, at every point in running time, I have a surface which is arbitrage-free, and it moves stochastically with the stock price, right? Because my log moneyness now depends on the running time little t. And so now I am assuming a model, right? So I said at first I'm not assuming models, but I said this is not entirely true, and this is where I do assume one. But the model is fairly general in the sense that, so I have my stock price, right? So ds over s is square root of v dB. The process v actually could be anything. I'm not assuming anything on v, sorry. Well, okay, I'm assuming it is of diffusion type, right? So no jumps, because I don't really believe in jumps, and no rough, right? So this is a standard Brown motion. And I'm assuming that I have actually, so I want the surface to move stochastically, so theta and phi also move stochastically, right? So they have two Brown motions, b theta and b phi. And okay, I have some fairly simple dynamics because I need to start from somewhere. And I can have correlations everywhere. And the question is, okay, is that consistent with arbitrage freeness? And one very important condition, which I did not mention, is this one, right? Where at maturity, the total implied variance has to be equal to 0, because you need to recover the payoff. If it's not 0, it means you don't recover the payoff. So this is very important because it kind of pins down the terminal value. And what we call a consistent total variance is that both the stock price and the call prices, so call prices, which are really Black-Scholes evaluated at the running log moneyness and running implied vol, have to get all the way to maturity. It turns out that in this case, well, there are two results. The first one is, you might say, disappointing, which is this is not possible. Meaning that in this model, you cannot find parameters, so you cannot find a solution to the SDEs that guarantee that both stock prices and call prices remain true martingales all the way to maturity. What actually happens is that these local, so consistent total variance models are actually martingale process. And again, martingale you can think of as arbitrage free, all the way to some point which is actually a bit before the maturity. And towards the end, well, they're not martingales anymore. They're strict local martingale, but they're not true martingales anymore. So what does that mean? So there's one interpretation, which is, so at first we thought, okay, there's a problem somewhere. So you check the results, you check twice, you check 3 times, and you convince yourself that no, it's correct. But then what does that mean? Does it mean the model is bad, it's wrong? We have to stuff it all together to the bin and start with something new? Well, maybe. But the other interpretation maybe is that simply you can't trade everything all the time. And this is not absurd, in fact, that you cannot have arbitrage freeness constantly throughout the whole life of the option for many reasons, maybe for liquidity reasons, because of costs and all that. So maybe it's not that absurd, actually. But of course, it might also be clearly a limitation of the model, and this is what we are currently doing and should be finished soon, which is to look at the case where we actually include the correlation. Because there we said we look at a smile which is symmetric, so no correlation, and that moves stochastically in time. If you add correlation, in principle, one could do the same thing, but it's just the computations are a bit nasty. So this is, there's hope that with correlation, you can achieve a bit more generality. So just to mention, we're not the first to look at this. So this, I should have said, this is joint work with Claude Martini and Mehdi El Amrani. There have been some papers in the past, starting from a long time ago. But somehow each paper was looking at a specific angle and missing some elements. And I think this gives a much clearer picture now. Okay, so I have about 15 minutes, something like that. So the last part is really pings on the subtitle, which was climbing on Roger Lee's shoulders, which was to say, now forget about little t, right? Little t is fixed, it's time 0, which is now, and I observe the surface. And in fact, I'm not even observing the surface, I'm observing a slice. Right, so little t is 0, capital T is fixed, whichever value you want, whichever value is observed, 1 year, 1 month, 1 week. And so I observe the implied vol as a function of x only, as a function of the log moneyness. And the question I want to ask is this, which is, how much information can I retrieve from the underlying process? So of course, it's clear, I'm absolutely clear that I will not be able to recover everything about the process, right? Simply because it's a process, and there I'm only looking at basically the marginal distribution of the process at one specific time in the future. But nevertheless, you can already get quite a bit of information. So the first thing is going back to Roger Lee's wing formula, and Roger Lee said what? Said that if I start, so S is non-negative, so a non-negative process, and I look at the moments, right? So again, capital T is fixed all throughout the remainder of the talk, and I look at the moment 1 plus P, and I'm looking for the largest P such that this expectation is finite. So I get a PRL. So RL is not right left, but it's Roger Lee, and beta R is the right slope of the smile. Right, so W is the smile, and so W of X over X is the slope when X is large. And what Roger Lee proved is that actually the slope, beta R, is actually a direct function of this largest positive moment. And this function psi, I will here, but we can forget, or we don't need to know exactly what it is for the sake of the talk. The important thing is that it belongs to 0, 2. Right, so the slope of the smile has to be between 0 and 2. And this is really assuming non-negative process and Martingale. Right, so Martingale in particular, of course, P is always greater than 0, right, because the first moment always exists. So you can never have a slope that is greater than 2. So this is the right wing, but you can do the same sort of left wing, meaning for small strikes, or log money is going to minus infinity. So there you look at the negative moments, and then the left slope, right? So Wx over x, or modulus of x, is again psi of this negative moment. Okay, so that's the first thing. So maybe one thing to mention, these are no limits, these are lim subs, right? So if you want to play a bit with that, so I'm going to skip the examples, but because things, well, the only thing I want to say about the example is that you actually have a large class of models, in particular all fine models, where you can do all these computations fairly in closed form. So you can compute this PRL and QRL in closed form, meaning you know exactly the slopes of the smile in terms of parameters of the model. But now how do we extend it? So first question is, okay, how do I go from lim sub to limit? And so that was done a few years ago by Shalom Benaim and Peter Fritz. And what we did was to look at it in 3 different directions. So first of all, so I'm going to look at them one at a time. The first case is what happens if the stock price has mass at 0. So what happens if the probability of ST being equal to 0 is actually strictly positive? So strictly less than 1, because otherwise there's really nothing to say. But we can see, right, if there's a mass at 0, then clearly I can't have any negative moment at all, right? Because this will be infinite immediately, meaning that Q Roger Lee will be 0. If Q Roger Lee is 0, then psi of 0 is 2. Right, so this is what I wrote. So Q, in that case, Q Roger Lee is 0, meaning the beta L, which is the slope, is 2, and meaning the slope is basically 2. But of course, you can have a model which has very fat tails, very fat left tail, right? Meaning that Q Roger Lee will be equal to 0, yet you don't have a mass at 0. Right, so the question is, if I observe the smile, so let me just momentarily go back here, I'll observe here, and let's say, for the sake of the argument, that the slope is 2, right? So this is basically 2 after that 2x. Somebody tell me whether that comes from a model with mass at 0 or a model with fat tail. Well, actually, if you know a trick, then I'm more than happy to hear it. But I'm not able to see that information like this. But in fact, what you can do is you can find Martingale's formula in this way, that if you have a mass at 0, so this calligraphic P is the mass at 0, then you can extend the smile, so I of x has this form. So let me just stop at this level here and forget about the other conditions. So when x is small, so x going to minus infinity, I first get this leading behavior, which of course we already know from moduli. But I also get an extra term here, a constant term. And then I get term that all this that goes to 0, right? So the nice thing here is that now, if I go back to my smile, I know exactly how to detect, how to extract that the information about mass at 0, because I can just plot the values of the smiles, and I fit a function square root of 2x plus a constant. And if the constant is non-zero, then it means I have a mass at 0, and I can actually extract this value. Right, so that's the first result we had a few years ago with Caroline Hilary and Stefano De Marco. Now, the second question we asked was, we had this example earlier about strict local martingale, but there's a funny example, well, funny, I find it funny, but at least interesting, let's say, which is going back to the strict local martingale case, so call it, that creates arbitrage if you wish, but let's just say strict local martingale in the sense that expectation of ST is strictly less than S0. Then you can actually compute the value of Rogeli largest moment, because this is a CV type of model. We know the density, so we can compute everything explicitly, and this is equal to 3. We can trust me there. Meaning what? Meaning that beta r, so the slope of the smile, if I apply Rogeli's formula, right, this is psi of 3, and psi of 3 is strictly less than 2. But now I can try to compute prices by Monte Carlo. I can convert prices into implied volatility, and I can check. And if you check, you will get something which is very different. So where does that come from? You could say, well, there's a problem in my numerics, which is always a possibility. You can also go back to Rogeli's formula and try to figure out that actually you really need the martingale assumption. If it's not a martingale, if it's only a strict local martingale, there is an issue. And so this is what we did a bit later, which is, so you have to use this concept of duality between, so S is a process, so actually, sorry, S is a strictly positive Q local martingale, and M a non-negative P martingale, right? So you have a duality between process and between two processes with their own probability measures. And what's important is basically that M is the inverse of S, but only up to a stopping time, where the stopping time is the first time that the process M hits 0. And what you get is this duality, which is the probability that the process M hits 0 at time little t is actually equal to, so I could or should replace the 1 by S0, in fact. This is the Martingale defect. Now, why do I call it Martingale defect? Because you remember that if S is a strict local martingale, this is strictly less than S0. And the equality if it's a martingale. Right? So this really is Martingale defect. Is how much am I from being a true martingale? And it's duality in the sense that this Martingale defect for S under Q is the same as the probability mass of M under P. And this is nice now because, of course, we can translate the left wing of the smile into the right wing of the smile. right? Because S being 1 over M, it will shift things from one side to the other. And so I won't go too much into the detail here, but you can basically translate this mass at 0 left wing of the smile into a strict local Martingale characterization of the smile on in the right wing of the smile. And you are able to recover this Martingale defect from the right wing of the smile. So this is all I want to say about this part. I want to spend the last few minutes about one last little things we looked at recently, which was just realizing that one thing that is very liquid, at least for S&P, are variance swaps, right? Which are essentially related to log moments, to pay log payoffs of the stock price, and for this log payoff you have this famous replication formula involving puts and call options. And of course, variance swaps are liquid, and you also have VIX that is very liquid, and so on. Now the question is, because variance swaps are replicated fully with calls and puts, in principle, if I have all the implied vol, I should be able to recover exactly variance swaps, right? Because if I have all the puts, if I have all the calls, I should get the log moments. If I have the log moments, then I get the variance swaps. There's something, however, a little bit tricky, which is, as we saw, calls and puts and Modigli's formula are related to the moments of S, the largest moment or smallest moment. But here, if I look at variance swap, this is not moments of S, but moments of log S. And the two, of course, are related, but not exactly the same. So the question is, can we write similar type of formula, but for the log process rather than the process itself? And the answer is yes. And so this is something we did recently with Raval. And so this is really Modigli's type formula. So you start with a true martingale, and I look at the largest moment such that, so not S, not the moments of S, but the moments of log S. And again, why do I look at these log moments? Because I don't start here with calls and puts, but I start with variance swaps. And if what I observe are variance swaps, then I get information about the log moments. And so I'm going to retrieve that information, this Q, from the data. And let's forget about limit. If I write it in a bit looser way in terms of implied vol, I get that the implied vol will have this behavior, square root of 2x. So you can think of fat tails, but then an extra term here, which is related not to the moments of S, but to the moments of log S. So if variance swaps are quoted, then you can actually extract information of variance swaps from the implied vol itself. I'm going to skip the last two bits. The last two bits are essentially saying that if I observe these variance swaps, then I can actually compute pretty much every payoff of the log stock price, either calls or puts or variance swaps or other options written on the log payoff. But I'm going to skip this part. And so I have a final slide, but given the time, I might stop here. The final slide was just to put things a bit together, but this is just a wrapping up slide for the whole talk. So I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you, Antoine. It's time for comments or questions. Are there any questions? Oral or by chat?
Yes, so it's the question about the last slide, which looks the most interesting of all of them. Sorry, but maybe it was planned by you. to have the last slide to be the most interesting, because I would say this is the crucial part of the program. That,
sorry.
Don't you hear me?
The last slide.
The very last slide of the presentation.
This one.
Yeah.
Okay.
This one. This is the major part of the program, that because what we are interested, you derived some nice properties of the observables, namely implied volatility. So this is what we observe in the market.
Yes.
But while pricing and doing all the quant stuff, we would like to know the model parameters.
Yes.
So there were several attempts to build Philip Schenbucher, Alan Brace, and others, and so to build a model from dynamics of observables, but they were not much successful. So you are close to solve that problem, or next year?
So I would say two things. First, I would say we are closer. Right? I'm not claiming to be close, but I think we're getting closer. Another thing I would add actually is that extracting that information, so getting the slope of the smile and the strict local Martingale power, the mass at zero, and all these little bits of information. I think if I'm a trader and I want to price a call or a put, I don't care about this really, right? Because the S&P will not default, so I can assume the mass at zero is zero. It's a strict local Martingale, so I don't really care about all these little, academic fancy details. However, where I think those things actually become interesting is, especially these days, and I would say especially, in these, forget about these two, right? Even though I like them, but forget about them. I would say in these two, and I would add a last bullet point, which are, this very trendy topic of neural networks. Where I think these are interesting is because now, this robust finance, these neural SDs and these neural networks, they work, they don't work, depending on how you tweak them and so on. But they're very hard to calibrate. They're very hard to fit. But now they might work better if you add constraints. So this is a little bit what Peter did with where they add conditions, right? So I think now we are providing a more precise set of conditions to ensure that the result of your optimal transport setup, or your neural SD or your neural network actually makes sense. Because if you restrict the set of the space parameters, then you will get something more sensible. So I think that's one way, I think, of using those results in a very efficient way. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm happy.
Yeah, because and of course, I'm still, I still like, and I like the fact that some people still use actually SVI or some ad hoc in-house version of SVI or SSVI, and I've seen many places use that. So I'm not discarding it altogether for pricing, but I think people are using more and more these kind of data-driven types of mechanics, and there you need these things. You need these conditions, because otherwise, the network might just output some completely bonkers model.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you.
Okay, Roberto.
Hi.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi, Jack. I have just two small comments. At the beginning, you have shown the implied volatility surface for short maturities and the stream strikes, and you have shown that there was a significant difference between call and puts, okay, in the implied vol. My comment is, what about showing this picture in prices or including bid asks? Since such a stream, probably with short maturity, I expect not so large difference in prices.
I fully agree. But you know, that's one thing I said was the talk is not about, you know, all the details of the prices. And I think it is extremely important, but this, in my view, this is a separate talk. You know, discussing, you know, what do I do with this bid? Calls and puts implied vol are different. There's a bid-ask spread. The concept of mid-price is pointless in a way. You want to be somewhere in the bid-ask if you price, if you calibrate. So my reference price somehow in the rest of the talk is an idealized price, right? Because there's no such mid-price, right? Nobody trades really at mid-price anyway. And you know, in some cases like here, okay, I don't even have puts, so of course, you know, put proprietary doesn't really make any sense either done immediately. So I fully agree with you. I could also have plotted indeed, you know, the liquidity where, you know, there's no put liquidity at all there. But this is interesting, and there are loads of other very tricky questions related to the behavior of these prices, especially, you know, if you look at end of day prices, which are completely rubbish prices. But this is a different talk, in my view.
Oh, thank you, Jack. And I have a second comment. You have shown the dynamics of the implied variance for a given maturity. Okay. What about considering a given time to maturity? Okay. I expect a simpler dynamics, at least in equity, since I expect as first order a sticky delta. Okay.
Yes. So here indeed we consider a fixed time to maturity, and the lower t goes to maturity. So that, you know, that's, I think, yeah, it depends on whether you look at fixed maturity or rolling maturity. So here we take this one. The honest answer is because actually it was easier. And so, okay, not just because it was easier, and in fact, some papers looked at it, but because this condition is actually very handy, right? Because it gives you a very particular structure where no matter what dynamics you put on W, it's kind of a bridge or pin diffusion where at maturity it needs to hit 0 to recover the payoff. So it gives you some extra, you know, structure to which to hold on. So I know we looked a bit at what happens with the rolling maturity, so that, you know, the remaining maturity evolves, but when we first looked at it, it was not, we didn't get too far. On the other hand, so I worked on it with Martini and a student, Media Amrani, and Claude and I are very historically, I'm not that old, well, not that young anymore, but not old, and we're very equity focused, right? So that's why we had this in mind. But of course, if you look at volume maturities, and in particular in FX, where you would look at, you know, where everything would be reparameterized in delta, things might change a bit. But yeah, I don't have a clear answer at the moment.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you. I think it's time for the next talk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antoine. Okay, Professor Miquel Noguer, are you here?
Yeah,
okay.
Hi.
Hello, hi.
Hi.
Maybe you can share your screen.
Sure.
Maybe I will make you co-host.
Buen día, Miquel.
Hola, ¿qué tal?
Okay. Okay, in fact, we see your screen, so for the moment, okay, and
Okay.
This is the first one. I present you. Okay, next speaker this morning is Miquel Noguer from New York Current Institute. And the title of his talk is Reinforcement Learning in US Equities. So, Miquel, when you want.
Yeah, so first, yeah, thank you very much for inviting me, Elisa, Josep, right, to this very interesting seminar. So I'm gonna talk about you know, a very well, obviously we think it's a very interesting topic, which is the use or not of reinforcement learning in US equities. So a different problem that Jack was addressing. So we think it's a okay. And we're going to explore during this hour how the different I'm going to do an intro on machine learning and the use of reinforcement learning, and then we're going to deep dive of one of our papers that explores the use of reinforcement learning in asset allocation problems, which is obviously one of the other central problems in finance is you know, asset allocation and well, I'll discuss also, you know, the different issues that arise when using mean variance and Black Learman and other interesting approaches, right? So just let me skip that. Well, in addition to teaching at NYU Corona, I'm also the founder of Artificial Intelligence Finance Institute and also head of development global AI. Previously, I've been in UBS and Unbank, and I'm professor currently at NYU Corona. I've been professor several years in Columbia, Imperial for 1 year, then also teaching in Barcelona. Okay, so let me first motivate a bit why using machine learning approaches. And I'll give you our take on the use of machine learning in finance, which is obviously you know, to a certain extent controversial, right? So we know all this, right? So this is the three fields or subfields of machine learning in finance. What was supervised learning and supervised learning, reinforcement learning. So supervised learning is supposed to, right, we do prediction and description and we learn regression functions, right? We go from Rn to R, we're being given inputs and outputs, and our job as machine learners or financial engineers is to learn the mapping, this function, this regression function from Rn to R, right? And yeah, we have to say that one of the benefits of using machine learning in finance is it's obviously the fact that it's very easy to some sort of model nonlinearities, but also the cause of dimensionality. So some other techniques, right, are having more trouble with high dimensions, and obviously machine learning, or at least the different algorithms, have been proven to be very effective when it takes to cope with high dimensions. And here certainly we'll have a highly dimensional problem. We sometimes have thousands of stocks, right, and hundreds of features, right, if we're talking about factor models. In addition to that, so for the ones working in the industries for several years, right, classification was not in the menu probably until, you know, machine learning brought to us. I'm not saying that we were not using classification, but certainly we weren't using them as fluidly as we're doing these days, right? And the idea here is to learn a class function. We go from Rn to K classes. We have K classes, and we're being given inputs and outputs, xi, capital Xi, Ci, and our job and the job of the algorithm is to learn the class functions, to learn a linear class function, nonlinear class function, being able to deal with high dimensions, being able to deal with noise, right? So we will discuss a bit before digging into reinforcement learning. Obviously, so finance is known to be well a difficult, right, field of application given the amount of noise. So I'll discuss it in a few minutes. Then we have unsupervised learning, right? So here, obviously, the idea is just to learn class functions, right? But we are only being given the inputs, right? So we're being given a data set that's hopefully highly dimensional. Well, that is highly dimensional, and we don't know. Maybe we don't know much about it, and can. So the first thing we do as data scientists, financial engineers might be, okay, so let's explore what can be a representation, what can be clustering, what can be a dimensionality reduction of these data set, right? And clustering representation learning, right? And obviously PCA, K-means, and there are obviously lately the use of deep learning to do unsupervised learning. It's also, right, very popular with the use of variational autoencoders, right, and so on and so forth. So unsupervised learning, and in addition to that, if we go to other problems, right, like for example language problems, they're also extremely successful. Then we will be focusing on reinforcement learning this talk. So reinforcement learning, broadly speaking, it's even more ambitious than supervised learning, because here what we want to know or we want to learn is a policy, right? A policy is a sequence of A's, right, or sequence of actions that we need to take, and X, capital X's are states of the world, right, and R, it's a reward function, right? So our job, loosely speaking, is to find out the optimal set of A's that given X's are going to maximize the R's, are maximize the reward function. So this is what we're going to be covering. I'm going to be covering in my talk. There's also very interesting some sort of subset, so to speak, of reinforcement learning. There was probably Igor Halperin was one of the ones pushing the idea is about inverse reinforcement learning, right? Sometimes, right, we just don't know the reward functions well, so we don't know. So arguably, right, one of the hardest areas obviously in modeling reinforcement learning problems is about figuring out the reward function. So sometimes we need to explore the reward function. So what we can do is we're being given tuples, which are the X's, the capital X's and the A's, the actions that we're taking in a specific environment, and then our job is going to find the reward function. So what was the reward function that motivated the agent to take these actions, right? So this is an interesting when we have some sort of problems defining the reward function. So we can actually try to, as previously said, use data in order to figure out what could be the empirical, right, reward function, right? The user cases are well known. So user cases are pretty much all over the place, in the sense that I think as data scientists or financial engineers, we spent at least, we spent, I wouldn't say most of our time, but a huge amount of our time doing regressions, right? So mapping data, mapping inputs to outputs. So we can actually use regression models, obviously, to earnings prediction, returns prediction, algorithmic trading, credit losses, and so on and so forth. And classification, it can be, right, used in a broad array of different uses: credit ratings, sustainable development scores, stock picking, fraud, anti-money laundering, right? In which, again, we have a data set in which the algorithms can learn, on the training set, and then on the test set, you evaluate how good your classification algorithms might be, right? And then unsupervised learning, right? You can do customer segmentation, stock classification, factor modeling, regime changes, and reinforcement learning. So reinforcement learning is actually, right, when you start looking at reinforcement learning, you see, okay, so how many intertemporal choice problems do we have in finance? So actually, so if you think about it, almost all the problems, or at least a big chunk of them, are intertemporal choice problems, right? Like, for example, trading strategies, like, for example, option replication. Data hedging is an intertemporal choice problem, and also marketing strategies, and one that I'll be addressing specifically, which is asset allocation, which is another intertemporal choice problem, right? And the question we'll be asking ourselves is, first of all, can these algorithms, right, or can reinforcement learning algorithms do the job of learning, right? For example, in a model-free setup, right, from data, can they learn how to asset allocate, right? Can they learn everything that it needs to be learned, right? So these are the kind of questions that we're going to be asking ourselves in my presentation, right? And inverse reinforcement learning, right, for example, can be used for, you have a data set, a banking data set, and you just don't know what is the reward function of banking clients. You can actually go there, look at the X's and look at the A's, and actually figure out what could be the reward function, right? So, okay. Now, let me say a word before, moving on into, so there's a lot being said. So I will be using in the paper deep neural networks, and there's obviously and there's a lot of there's a lot of good and healthy discussion and controversy around the use of non-parametric models, right, or semi-parametrics, right? We can say that machine learning or deep neural networks are some sort of a non-parametric way to address these problems, right? And there's a lot to be said, and I'll discuss that on the cons. But on the pros, you have to say that when you start using deep neural networks, right, you can actually, right, when you use it in factor models time series classifications, we have some papers on SSRN that cover that. Oftentimes you get state-of-the-art results, right? I'm not saying, right, and I will not be saying that this is the deep neural network is actually what you have to use. But what we are saying is that actually deep neural networks in many environments that can actually do the best job, some sort of a job as good as your best parametric model, right, can do, right? And and we're going to be using today a deep reinforcement learning, right? So as a function approximator, we're going to be using LSTMs, long short-term memory networks. We're going to be using convolutional neural networks, which are two architectures that hopefully the audience knows a bit, right? There's also an important controversy as to whether trees and decision trees, which is these models that are some sort of a set of if-then-else conditions that map the outputs to the inputs, right, are also extremely good. And there's still a lot of research needed in order to make the bridge, right, between what the efficacy of the trees, the efficacy of the neural networks, and the comparison with parametric models, right? And here is in the con side where we're being more some sort of, so obviously practitioners, machine learners, statisticians say, okay, well, this is finance, right? There are lots of things here that we need to consider, right? First of all, non-stationarity, so which I think is one of the central problems in finance. And we're just writing a paper on this, but we wrote a paper on this using meta-learning to try to deal with non-stationarity. But the main idea of non-stationarity, as we all know, so the strict definition of non-stationarity is things have the same expectation, the same variance, right, over time, right? And if it's a multivariate, so also dependencies are stable, right? So okay, so it's hard to argue that finance is stationary in the sense that we know these things are not evolving or are evolving over time, right? So the idea is, can we model better out of distribution events or OODs? Can we use causality methods and learn the structure? These are very interesting open questions, right? That obviously non-stationarity will be one issue that the reinforcement learning algorithms are going to need to deal with, right? In the sense that what happens if the agent all of a sudden was thinking that he was operating in a specific environment, all of a sudden conditions change and you have another multivariate statistical distribution to deal with, right? Or some sort of multivariate stochastic process that you have to deal with, right? Okay, so non-stationarity remains obviously one of the main problems, not only for finance, also for reinforcement learners, right? In the sense that can the agents adapt to new environments? And here I have to say that, well, there are two views on that. One view is, okay, we cannot model unknowns. Unknowns by definition are unknown, they're unbounded, so we can do very little about them. And the other is we can do things because models, the evolution, right, of these multivariate distributions can be maybe switching to a neighborhood, right? Or we can find structure, right, on these ones. So our job is to find, right, those similarities, right, between what can happen in the future and what we see in the data set, which is obviously one of the main some sort of critics also of quantitative finance, in the sense that, right, oftentimes, I'm just saying, not always, is based on historical data, and life has been very hard, and life has shown us that actually the future oftentimes is nothing like we saw in the past, right? So okay, so that's one of the main problems that we and all models, also econometric, all models were had to deal with, right? Then it's interpretability. Well, obviously, right, this is our high dimensional, right? And a lot of work needs to be done on the interpretability side. So obviously there's Occam razor and those inductive biases. You prefer simple models, not only because they seem to generalize better, but also because they're easy to interpret, right? If it has a linear model with low degrees of freedom, right, it's actually more interpretable. So, and here, right, okay, so here we have this trade-off between, again, interpretability and the use of highly dimensional neural networks. Now, a very interesting topic, it's about overfeeding, right? Overfeeding, we're just finishing a paper in which we discuss overfeeding. So overfeeding is nothing like we thought it was, right? So we thought overfeeding was a U-shape. So in the Friedman books, right, and all the statistical machine learning books, we learn, right, that, okay, when you increase the dimensionality of your neural networks or trees or whatever, right, so now you end up and you over-parameterize, you end up in this overfitting region in which the test set is much, so the test error is much higher than the training error, right? Okay, so this is the problem, obviously. We just want them to be close and very low, right? Okay, but even this is different in finance, right? Okay, so we will show soon, right, that it's not a U-shape, it's not a double descent shape, which is another performance function that has been shown in other papers recently, right? Okay, but it's more flat. And there's obviously the question about enough data. Do we have enough data to use highly dimensional models, right? And the answer is probably not, right? But at the same time, right, we need to rewrite the mathematics of statistical machine learning, in the sense that there are many counter examples of us memorizing the data and then seeing that it generalizes well. So it's not enough to say, I will never have enough data for these deep nets, right? because again, we see lots of examples, and with deep nets, apparently, according to statistical theory, didn't have enough data, but in the end, they generalize well. And there's a lot of theories, and there's and one of the areas that you could look at, it's inductive biases and things like that. Okay, so these are the issues. So oftentimes very good performance, right, in the training set, and reasonable or good performance in the test set, and all these cons, right? So okay, so we wrote a paper, right, with Sona and Srivastava, an Indian researcher, about, well, a very interesting question. So we know reinforcement learning is this approach concerned with solving dynamic optimization problems, right? So we have a lot, as I said, of dynamic optimization problems in finance, data hedging, asset allocation, right? You know, high frequency problems, market impact problems, right? So we have lots of them, right? Can we do that in an almost model-free, right? By maximizing this reward function in a state and action spaces, right? So can we do that, right? So and again, one area in which we're going to try this, it's the asset allocation area. So the asset allocation, we know, is to obtain the weights of the assets that maximize the rewards in a given state of the market, right? And what we do is an additional thing. So we're also going to be considering transaction costs, right? And we're not going to be considering risk. We'll see that. So what we will do is we will use a reward function that are the returns, right? We will not tell the reinforcement learning agents that they need to consider risk, right? Okay, so they will need to maximize return by looking at the time series, right, of stocks, right? And they'll need to figure out what are the weights, right? And also they will need to deal with transaction costs. So the idea is remember what we do, right? When we do asset allocation. So what do we do when we do asset allocation? It is a three-step process, right? The first step is we need to, Markowitz told us, right, that then the way you need to deal with these problems, if you need a vector of expected return. So our first job is to get this vector expected returns. So as we know, this is very hard, right? The second thing is we need a covariance matrix, right? Okay, if we have the two, right, and this is elliptical distribution, this is usually quadratic programming problem. So we don't even need super fancy, right, non-convex optimization methods. We can actually solve it analytically, right? But then there's a third step, right, which is considering the market impact, okay? So we're going to need to consider market impact. So what we will do what we do in our paper is we do all the three things in one step, right? So the reinforcement learning agent is going to need to learn how to deal with these issues, right? Maximizing the return, taking into consideration transaction cost, right? And as I said, the reinforcement learning agent is going to be learning, right, how to deal with risk, and we're not telling them the risk is something important, right? So which is an interesting one. Okay, will this be learning everything? I think the answer is almost everything, but not everything, right? So I'll discuss that at the end of my presentation. Okay, so then so what we're going to do then is compare that to the different approaches, right? Of mean variance, asset allocation. So, okay, so Markowitz invented or discovered mean variance. He got the Nobel Prize, and we're all very happy about it, right? He said all you need is a vector expected returns, a covariance matrix, right? And this is a quadratic programming problem. You can actually solve it, and get your optimal weights, right? Is this working in real life? Well, the answer is no, not at least not fully. What is the problem? Right, there are two main problems, right, in Vim variance, right? The first problem is well, we don't know the vector spectral returns and covariance matrices, right? So so if we know we have the optimal, we actually don't know them, right? So there's actually an estimation problem. Is this a big problem? Yes, it is. It's a huge problem, right? It's very hard to get a vector spectral returns for S&P 500 for next week, for next month. It's incredibly hard, right? So we have, and so that's one. Estimation is one problem. The second is, the second problem we have is it's mean variance. It's very sensitive to the ingredients. So we have, again, a very beautiful and good model, which the assumptions are not met in the sense that we do not know the vector spectral returns and the covariance metrics. And in addition to that, the model is very sensitive, right, to small changes in returns, small changes in variances, small changes in correlations. Okay, so the financial industry or the financial researchers have invented several models to deal with that, right? Being one of them, for example, risk parity. Instead of using returns and risks, we're gonna only be using risks, right? So we're gonna be using only the covariance metrics, and we're gonna allocate the same amount of the same marginal contribution to risk to every asset, right? And we're not going to be considering returns. So it's a very, so it's an extreme example of shrinkage, right? So we don't trust the returns, so we're not going to use them, and we're going to make an implicit assumption, which is that all the assets used are going to have the same Sharpe ratio, right? So the same. So these assets are going to be rewarding risk with the same amount of reward, right? Okay, and then we have something. The 1 divided by n portfolios, equally weighted portfolios. You just invest 1 divided by n on every asset. So here you don't consider anything and no risk. You just consider nominal risk, so to speak, right? And you have others, right? Like Black Leaderman, which is a Bayesian way of introducing views and making more. Okay, so we're going to be comparing these different models. And what we're going to do is we're going to be picking 24 stocks in the US equities universe with daily rebalancing, and then we're going to be using deep reinforcement learning, right? Okay, I'm not going to specifically discuss in depth why we think deep reinforcement learning, but here, instead of other temporal differences approaches and so on. But let's say these neural networks seem to deal better with things like a reasonable amount of stocks. So we're using here 24, which is not a large number, right? But you see out there lots of papers of reinforcement learning using 5 stocks, because some of the other approaches to solve reinforcement learning, right, actually do not work very well, right, with in very high dimensions. But LSTMs, CNNs, and RNNs, so long-chain memory networks, convolutional neural networks, and recurrent neural networks seem to be dealing well with this problem, right? So you can find the paper on SSRN. So let me now spend time with the specifics of how we actually put everything in the framework of reinforcement learning, right? So optimal control, reinforcement learning is the optimal control of unknown Markov decision processes, right? We try to capture the most important aspects of a real problem interacting with its environment over time, and the agent tries to maximize a goal related to the state of the environment. You can find, obviously, the best reference you can use is Sutton and Barrett 2018. I think this is an extremely good. And mathematically speaking, reinforcement learning is a way to solve multi-period optimal control problems, right? So again, as I said, this is actually finance is full of them, of multi-period optimal control problems, right? So here, the policy, so the set of actions will typically consist of explicitly maximizing the action value function for the current state. The value function, which is an essential tool in reinforcement learning, is an approximation of the actual value function of the multi-period optimal control problem, and the training is going to refer on improving the approximation of these value functions as more training examples are made available, right? So I'm going to be defining in a second what these value functions are, right? And you will see that actually it's very natural, right? The way these value functions can fit, right? Some sort of finance theory, right? Okay, so reinforcement learning is different with supervised learning in the sense that the agent, I would say that the main difference, right? It's not about the data sets, right? Because also reinforcement learning needs to learn, right? So many people say, okay, supervised learning, you need data because you need to map inputs to outputs, right? But reinforcement learning, you need actually the same thing. If you want the agent to be intelligent, so it needs to know, right? In the different environments, how it needs to operate. So, and the way it's going to learn that, right? It's obviously the more data you will have, the more intelligent or the more efficient, right, your agent will be. Okay, so here we have more other definitions. The agent is acting in an environment. So how the environment acts to specific action is defined by a model that we might be known or not, right? So here we're also going to need the transition probabilities, which states P that govern the state that the agent arrives at, and once then an action is taken, then the environment might deliver an instant or delayed reward, right? So here, one interesting thing about finance is actually it's not very hard or it's, let's say, it's not maybe as hard as in other disciplines to define a reward function, because here we know it, right? All we care is about returns or risk-adjusted returns. So here, reward function, we're gonna not need to invent a very, right? And then in terms of using, knowing the model and using model-based RL or model-free RL, right, here we're going to be using model-free RL. So we're going to give the agents data, we're going to give the agents value functions and value functions approximators, and then these agents, after seeing many years of data, right, will probably be learning what they need to do in this environment, right? So here we have more definitions. So the agent policy pi guides the optimal action to be taken in a state to maximize total rewards, right? Here we have the two, the different categories, model-based, model-free, right? So again, we will be using model-free. We'll assume that agents do not have, right, knowledge about the model. They will be learning, right, the model with the initial data set. Okay, then we have on policy of policy, and then the way we the model will try to describe the environment, right? So the model can infer how the environment would interact with and provide feedback with the agent, and we need two significant parts: a transition probability function and a reward function, right? Okay, so let me skip in the interest of, you can read that in the paper, right? But well, maybe just so the policy, so is the agent sequence of actions pi, right? That tell us which action to take in a state S. We have a stochastic and deterministic, right, policies, and then the value function. The value function is going to be what we're going to be using and measures the future reward of a state of an action, and the return of future reward is the total sum of discounted rewards. Here we have a discounting factor. The discounting factor actually takes care of the risk of those rewards going forward, right? And it has to, and discounting factor, it's for mathematical reasons, it's convenient for mathematical reasons, so this thing doesn't go to infinity. And on the other side, just because there's it's a partially observable a process, and there's stochasticity in it, right? Okay, so now we can define the Q function, the action value, Q value function as this expression here, right? The Q pi SA is the expectation given a policy, right? A capital G given a capital S T equals to S, A T equal to A. So you start at a specific place. Okay. Now the optimal value function is the one that will achieve the maximum return, right? And here we have all the Bellman equations theory, that are sets of equations that decompose the value function and the immediate reward and discounted values. And you can do the same thing for the Q value. Okay, so how does this fit? Can we actually create, right, value functions that are actually sensible and good for finance? The answer is, well, Coleman Reader, right, in 2019, right, some sort of put together this some sort of very nice value function. So V pi S is this expectation, this expected integrand from integral from 0 to capital T. And what we have here, right, is some things that are pretty familiar for finance and financial engineers, which XTRT is the reward, and then we have this lambda half x squared t sigma squared t, and this is what? This is the risk, right? Okay, so here you're using the risk, and then minus f x dot dt. What fx dot is the market impact, right? So if we want to be right, as I said, complete in our approach, we want to need to we actually going to need to deal with the three, right? And this is consistent with the 3 steps that I mentioned, right? You need to first figure out the returns, the better of returns. You need to figure out the covariance metrics of these guys, right? And then you need to be considering the risk, the market impact, right? And we know the theory that many researchers have been working on this market impact, like Jim Gatherell, right, from Baruch and others, right, about how can we incorporate market impact in our modeling, right? Okay, let's move on. How do we solve RL problems, right? So we can use Monte Carlo method. So in order to we know that our models follow the Bellman equations, so we can use dynamic programming to evaluate value function iteratively and improve policies. We can use Monte Carlo, temporal differences, Q-learning, and policy gradient to follow model-free approaches. And we have the actor and the critic and so on, right? But okay, so this is how we're going to do it, right? So so this is a typical graph explaining reinforcement learning. So we have an agent, the tensor of features is the state, we have the environment, which is the market, we have the cost adjusted returns. Okay, so we're going to be considering also costs, right? And the action, so the agent are going to need to figure out at every step of the way what is the action that needs to be taken, right, in this specific again state given the environment, right? So we're going to be using the reward as reward functions the average algorithmic cumulative returns, right? Okay, so we're going to be using, again, returns, as I said before, and the question will be, do we need to give to the agents also risk information, or are they actually going to need to, they're actually going to learn, right, that they need to do that? So in principle, in this paper, we just used a reward function, the returns, right? And here we have the learning details, right? But maybe, okay, but then let me focus more on the details of the neural networks, right? So first, well, maybe first, what are the comparative net frameworks? So this is going to be the baselines. So we're going to be comparing what the nets or the deep reinforcement learning results are comparative to equal weighted portfolios, a Markovich approach, so mean variance optimization. And by the way, in this approach that we use in the paper, it's a time series approach. We don't use factors. So this is oftentimes a question that we get asked, right? As is this the only way to define the state of the world? The answer is obviously not, right? This is just a time series, right? A kind of exercise, right? So we're not looking at valuations, momentums, and so on. Well, momentums are probably being tracked by the neural networks. Okay, risk parity, right? Okay, by Roncalli and collaborators in 2016. The idea of risk parity, as I said before, is that you're going to be investing the same marginal contribution to risk in each and every one of these 24 stocks. Minimum variance. Okay, and then this is the architecture that we used. So we used the HLC for 25 stocks for 50 periods as a tensor of 3 for 25 by 50, and then we do a 1/3 ReLU convolution. So we use here neural networks, and then what we have is two things, right? A portfolio vector memory. So we're going to be comparing a portfolio vector with the weights of the last portfolio that we had, and we're going to be comparing right with the current, right? And the way we're going to actually figure out the portfolio weights is going to be a softmax layer, right? And a softmax layer is being used in classification problems, right, to speed probabilities. So we're going to make the assumption, right, that this softmax layer that actually computes for any probabilities of classification, it's obviously sum up to 1, and it's positive, right? So it's actually, it fits well with the idea that we need constraints with this portfolio. We don't want just to be, right, unbounded, so that we have, infinite leverage, right, or allowing short positions, right? So that's why, so the softmax, the final softmax layer here, it fits nicely with the idea that you need a vector of weights that are positive and they add up to 1, like probabilities, so to speak. Okay, then we basically, the configurations of the neural networks, we're using convolutional neural networks and long short-term memory networks, right? And the training range is from 1st January 2008 to 23rd March 2017, right? For both CNNs and LSTMs, right? And the testing range is 24th March 2017 to 1st June 2020, right? Both, right? So we actually, and it's actually, we think it's a hard some sort of problem, because because here you'll see the nets need to deal with the COVID crisis, right? And they probably haven't seen, right, something like that. And you'll see they also struggle, right, with the fact that all of a sudden you have a 6 sigma, 5 sigma event, right, and so on and so forth, right? Anyway, so here we have the details of the neural network. So 1/2 convolutional layer, 1/24 convolutional layer, the portfolio vector memory layer, because we need the previous portfolio, and we compare both, and then it's how the nets are going to learn transaction costs to deal with them. And here we use all the samples, the learning rate of the two, the epochs, 50,000, the batch size, and then we're using both Adam optimizer, right? Again, you can find the details on the paper. The results, right? So here, yeah, so results, well, obviously, as usual, the usual disclaimer, right? The usual disclaimer is this is not, so this is one experiment in which, again, the nets or the reinforcement learning agent looks at the time series of these stocks, right, for 10 years, right? And then it tries to learn what it needs to do, right, in the testing, so in real life, in this 24th March 2017 to 1st June 2020, right? Okay, so so this is a real life example, right? So statistically speaking, is obviously just one, right? So okay, so so we cannot say that this is going to be right, or this is an extremely robust version, right? Okay, but we think it's so what happens if we look at the returns? So total returns of these March 2017 to 1st June 2020, total returns is 28, 38, 37, 34, 28, right? For, let's say, the more traditional methods, right? And the total returns for CNNs, right? With weight control, when we say weight control is they have to deal with transaction costs, right? Okay, so okay, we see here that the CNNs with no weight get to 154, right? So they seem to, right? Okay, what? Okay, so we see that here. Are we claiming that this is so this means that this reinforcement learning models is what you need to use in the future, which is obviously the question you're asking yourselves, right? So we don't think, so we think more research is needed in the sense that, first of all, what we're doing here, right, is trusting that the nets have been learning how to allocate, right? And we have to say that it's pretty impressive, the fact that with no notion of risk, the agents seem to be learning, right, that they need to allocate and pay attention to risk, right? There are other evolutions of the model in the reward function. Actually, you can actually say, okay, I'm going to use risk indicators and so on and so forth. Here, we don't do that, right? So it's actually, again, very surprising that the framework, that the nets or the deep reinforcement learning model it's able to learn by itself, right? How to do the whole thing, right? Does it learn everything? So the question is, if you look at the paper, in the paper we actually show the weights, right? And one thing that these nets haven't learned, right, is something that it's also not baked in mean variance and others, which is they're very abrupt, right, with the allocation. So the CNNs with no weight control sometimes have the portfolio in just 1-2 stocks, which we know is not something that you're going to allow in real life, because you're scared of idiosyncratic risk, right? We have to say, though, right, that the fact that they don't learn about they don't seem to be learning about the idiosyncratic risk, it probably means because they haven't seen enough examples, right, of some sort of one stock black swan events that actually make the portfolio just blow up, right? Okay, but this is again, idiosyncratic risk is one of the things you could be considering that you need to tell as an inductive bias to the neural networks, right, in order to improve the model, right? Again, inductive biases is that, right, you know, these neural networks have been able to find, right, good solutions, right, but but there are many of them, right? And actually, inductive biases actually help us choose, right, which one of these is. So that's why a good inductive bias that the model probably needs is idiosyncratic risk. But yeah, again, we think that we think that actually, right, a model-free deep reinforcement learning model can actually do this that Coleman Reader describe in their paper, right? And is they consider obviously reward because this is on returns, because this is on the reward function. They learn to consider risk, right? The transaction costs are in the model, so they learn that if that reward it has to be right cost adjusted, right, in terms of transactions or market impact, right, and they seem to be learning that, right. So we think the paper proves that, right, actually, right, again, with 10 years of data, agents seem to be using a deep reinforcement learning model can do model-free RL here. And an open question is if the results that shown here are better just because, right, you know, we were lucky in the data set, right? We don't think so, but it's obviously, right, okay, but yeah, but it's actually, right, again, very interesting to see that these RL algorithms are actually learning to deal with. So extensions of these, right, is, well, one obvious is do factors improve results, right? Obviously, I think with no doubt the question is yes. So we haven't used them, right? But you can actually then use more features for every stock, right? Valuation, momentum, size, and other factors, and see which ones are the ones that agents consider that have to be used when they choose stocks and they asset allocate. So yeah. And yeah, that's it, right?
Okay, thank you, Miquel. Are there any questions or comments?
I have a question, Miquel. So when we work with the cryptocurrencies, that it is something very new, how do you deal with this? Because there is no previous experience. So machine learning, it's based on learning from the past, I understand.
Yeah, well, yeah. So what are the limits of, right? Yeah, that's a good question, right? So the question is, well, you have a limited data set, right? And finance, it's you know, data sets are always small, right? The question is, the questions are, right? Is the future going to be as what they have seen, right? The answer is always probably no, right? In the future, there's going to be lots of unknowns and so on and so forth. But there's some hope in the sense that maybe the nets have discovered some representation that allows them, right? Allows them to some sort of generalize better, right? But what agents and deep reinforcement learning agents will not be solving is the fact that if you have processes like cryptos that have even a higher noise to signal ratio, right? They are very hard to model with any supervised learning, not only machine learning, but also econometrics. You try econometrics in cryptos and it's extremely hard. So you can actually deduce, right, that reinforcement learning, which actually needs to go to the same using similar tools, right, are also going to struggle, right? You see what I mean? It's about finding, right? So in the end, predicting, it's about finding some structure that allows you to generalize. It's to find some function, linear, non-linear, that allows you to generalize for what you have seen, right? Okay, and the answer isn't as simple as it's not possible, as I said before, because there are lots of unknowns, because there's some structure in it, right? But again, cryptos are a hell of a hard problem for not only machine learning, econometrics. You can deduce that it's if you have econometric hard problem, supervised learning algorithms are also going to struggle. You cannot just imagine that they're going to invent. You see, we'll show that in a new paper, right? In the sense that there's a limit. So Friedman told us, right, that there's a part that if you decompose risk minimization and the expectation, you have the bias and the variance. This is what is captured by the model, and then you have the expectation of epsilon, which is the pure randomness, so to speak. If this is very large, obviously your model is going to be very limited, right? Okay. Obviously, you can say, right, maybe deep nets, right, for example, are going to be learning better, right, than other models, the probability distribution. So the multivariate probability distributions is something that deep neural networks deal with very well, right, implicitly or explicitly, right? Okay, but yeah, so I haven't answered your question in the sense that, yeah, also machine learning algorithms in the presence of limited data, very high noise to signal ratio are going to struggle big time, right? So this is no surprise. But if you use standard econometric models, it's a very hard problem, right? So we tried, I think, 3 years ago, right? And again, it was a very hard problem for econometric models and certainly for deep nets. It was also right, a hard problem, right? I don't know if anybody in the audience has a better answer for it, right? But just as a note aside, so ML reinforcement learning, these techniques are very good for multidimensional spaces to discover things and so on. But that doesn't mean that they can all of a sudden, and finance doesn't seem to be one of these areas in which you're going to see dramatic increases, right, in test set performance. Okay, and again, we're going to be showing these in a new paper in which no matter how large the deep net is, you pick the S&P 500, right? And all of a sudden you get stuck to 52, 53 accuracy, right? And there's not much more that you can do using time series, right? Using time series. And it's probably the limit of predictability is that low, right? In finance. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Raul?
Hello, I have one question. Well, at least one question.
Yeah.
In the case of the neural networks, it seems that you have optimized the total returns, but have you tried to find which is the portfolio who has the less variance and the minimum drawn down? Because, for example, the minimum variance portfolio, it's true that the return is the smallest, but also the maximum drawdown is the smallest. What if you want to find the minimum variance portfolio with neural networks? Have you tried something like that?
No, we haven't. Right. No, I think there are many questions that it still can be asked, right, to this RL, right? Again, here we give the minimal information to the nets. They seem to be learning. And we also say in the paper, we don't think that's enough, right? In the sense that you probably need to bake, risk constraints, right? So because you need to deal with idiosyncratic risk, right? but also the data is telling you a different story. Is that probably in the last 10 years you haven't seen such a huge idiosyncratic event that makes that on a data set perspective tell you that you should be taking care of idiosyncratic risk. But again, this is one of these inductive biases that we as a practitioners, we know we have to bake in if the model learns it or not, right? If the model doesn't learn idiosyncratic risk, you have to tell it, right? Yeah, we know you haven't learned that, but this is an important problem. So we now need to constrain, right? And we don't want the weights to be more than 5%, right? And so on and so forth. There's also discussions around, you can actually try to, is it doing C-bar, right? Conditional barrier risk. So do you need to give it conditional barrier risk? Anyway, so there are lots of very interesting questions that remain unanswered. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Are there any other questions or comments?
I think Darius wants to.
Yeah. I've got a question, and a bit more fundamental one, so not about details of your talk.
Yeah.
It starts with a story. It was 25 years ago. I was a young, inexperienced, and promising trader, and all my gurus told me at the very beginning, never try to use statistical method when estimating volatility. Volatility must be taken from the market and not from the past, because markets, there are no general rules how markets behave. So these days we hear a lot about machine learning, artificial intelligence, what in fact is using statistical methods. So it's not all mathematical statistics, but it's all data science for sure. So what's your opinion on that? Who was right? Nassim Taleb or the people from the other side of the spectrum?
No, right? Yeah, well, I mean, no. I think yeah, options are an incredibly interesting problem, right? That and you would say, okay, there's a lot of data out there. You can actually go and use these non-parametric methods, right? But things aren't as easy as picking a data set, right, and throwing these beasts, right? And why is that? You mentioned it. So you want some properties, right, to be somehow met. So you cannot guarantee that if you throw the deep neural networks and approximate what they see, they're going to be paying attention to non-arbitrage and some sort of things that you see in the data sets, but it's because market is not complete and because prices were not as, and so on and so forth. So you have some properties of the model that you want it to be, and I think if we want a robust model, right, I think the nets should be considering all these some constraints that if you use a parametric model, you're able to bake in, right? So I think we still a long way to go in terms of, we know these can approximate very well, right? But we still lack inductive biases. So what are the properties that these solutions need to meet? You see what I mean? Because again, this is the example we just shown, is that you cannot just trust blindly a data-driven approach, right? In the sense that maybe a data-driven approach hasn't been learning some principles that we think are important, that you can actually bake into a more parametric model. And in a semi-parametric model, it's a little bit harder, but you need it anyway, right? So that's why sometimes you need all the options market and in a parametric model, and then that actually gives you prices that meet those constraints, right? And then you throw the deep nets. And then the problem is you have to reconcile the results of these with real life results, right? So yeah, I think your intuition and our intuition is right. So these things find right, so lots of good solutions out there, right? And we would like to just pick the ones that meet certain constraints in terms of risk, in terms of shape, in terms of, right, and there's still a long way to go, right? I think that's why that's one of things that in the model risk committees of big large institutions need to be discussed. So not only interpretability, which is an obvious one, but also other solutions of these meeting some sort of again, theoretical constraints that we think solutions should meet.
Thank you.
I don't know if I've been clear, but
yeah,
yeah,
it's an answer.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Maybe it's time to make a break. So we make a break and we return at 11:30. Okay, so 20 minutes break.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, next speaker is Michele Yazzone from Politecnico di Milano. And the title of his talk is Short-Time Implied Volatility of Additive Normal Temperature Stable Processes. So, Michele, when you want.
Okay. Good morning to everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I will be talking about the short-time implied volatility of this additive process that was also discussed by my supervisor, Roberto Baviera, in a yesterday talk. So what we will be doing, it's we will deduce this the short time at the money implied volatility and the skew for this class of pure jump additive process. Additive process are, as already mentioned by Roberto, an extension of the V process that has that have independent but not stationary increments. We will show that it exists one process inside the family of normal temperature stable process that has finite at the money implied volatility and a power scaling skew. So as is well known in the literature, all pure jump levy process have a problem at short time because their implied volatility at the money goes to 0. We will be able to prove that instead there exists a pure jump additive process where the limit of the implied volatility at the money at short time is a positive and finite constant. You can look to this reference for short time result on implied volatility and skew on pure jump process and also on jump diffusion process. But clearly the literature is quite vast and there are a lot of contribution on the topic, even if we restrict ourselves just to the levy case. We will use in this talk this measure of moneyness. This is the moneyness degree that was introduced by Medvedev and Scaillier and is just like the standard log moneyness, so the logarithm of the strike over the forward price, but it's divided by the square root of the time to maturity. It's another measure of moneyness, and it's more convenient for us in our to use that in our calculation. But what is the implied volatility with respect to the moneyness degree? If we select a day, this is the 22nd of June of 2020. It was, I think, the first Monday after the triple witching Friday. We can see some characteristic of the equity implied volatility surface of the S&P 500. On the left, we see the first 4 maturities. We have the implied volatility with respect to the minus degree. As you can see, if we look at the money, the level of the volatility in the first 4 maturities appear quite constant. So for sure, the implied volatility do not goes to 0, but this is effect in all asset classes. And we can say something also about the slope of the implied volatility with respect to y. And we see that this slope appear to be constant. Why this is important? Because it is linked directly to the skew. On the right, we can see the S&P 500 skew on this day, and the red triangles are the market skew in the different maturities, while the blue line is a fitted function that goes as -1 over the square root of t. And so also in this day, as was mentioned, I think in a lot of other talk during this workshop, we observe a power scaling skew. And this power scaling skew is directly linked to the fact that the derivative with respect to y is constant over time. Also, I want to stress that this day was a day of particular stress in the market, because we were in June 2020, so fear of the second wave, the market was a bit crazy. The level of volatility, if you look at it, is quite higher compared to other days in the S&P 500, but still the power scaling skew is still here. Clearly, this is just an example of one day, but there are empirical studies on this, for example, Karen Wu on 2003 and a lot of others, which identify, first of all, that the money implied volatility at short time should be positive and finite, but this is a well-known fact for any asset class, but mainly that the skew in the equity market usually goes as -1 over the square root of t. We will be able to show that a pure jump additive process has these features. So at the money implied volatility, positive and finite at short time, and skew that goes as -1 over the square root of t. We can write a Medvedev-like expansion of the implied volatility with respect to the minus degree y. Is a classic first order expansion, but we just want to redefine the at the money implied volatility, IT of 0 as sigma at t, and also the slope of the implied volatility with respect to y as xi at t. As we have observed from the plot, but it is clearly very easy to prove it directly, the skew is this xi at t over the square root of time. So it's quite important that we can study sigma at t and xi at of t to check the two conditions on the demand implied volatility and on the skew that we have mentioned. Specifically, the market characteristic imply that sigma at 0 should be positive and constant, and xi at 0 should be negative and constant. We refer to sigma at 0 and xi at 0. We call this the limits in 0 of sigma at t and xi at t, just to simplify the notation. So now we can speak about the implied volatility problem. We have to define it, and to do so, we give an alternative definition of the additive normal temporary stable process. Specifically, we are interested in the law for a fixed time t. So we start with a positive random variable, st, that we introduce through its Laplace transform. This is the Laplace transform of the Lévy temporary stable subordinator. So, for example, inverse Gaussian or gamma subordinator, but with a power law scaling parameter k. K is the parameter linked to the vol of vol. So this k scale with power scaling beta. So the key scaling parameter here is beta. Also, this was mentioned in Roberto's talk. And the expression that we give of the additive normal temporary stable process is this random variable ft that is again based on the scaling parameter delta of the eta t term. This can be seen as some kind of time change Brownian motion with a asymmetry term eta. But what is important is that we can see that the characteristic function is the same of the ATS that was discussed in Roberto's talk. So we have the random variable, and we can write the implied volatility equation for a fixed maturity. We have this equation in equation 2. First, I want just to mention that we consider no discount and the forward price equal to 1. This is because this quantity can be easily simplified from the implied volatility equation. So for the sake of simplicity, we just don't consider them. And on the left of the implied volatility equation, you can see the classical black price. This is defined with respect to the money's degree, but it's the same. And on the right, we have the expected value with respect just to ST. So we were able to deal with the Gaussian random variable, and this is something very similar to the Allen-White formula. So CT is a slight modification of the black formula. So from the implied volatility equation, we are able to arrive to the main result of this talk. We will investigate the short-time behavior of the additive normal temporary stable process over the range of admissible scaling parameter, beta and delta. Even this result was presented by Roberto. We see that it exists an ATS if beta and delta satisfy these two inequalities. So we have a range of admissible scaling parameters. This is the range. As you can see, this is for a generic alpha, but the application that Roberto were discussing were mainly for alpha equal to 0 and for alpha equal to 1/2, but these results are for any valid alpha. But we can exploit this plot also to already explain the main result, because what is important in the short time is the scaling parameter. So for the different scaling parameter, we have, for the different 4 cases, we have different results. We can start with case 1. In case 1, that is the beta less than 1 and delta above minus 1/2, we have that the short time implied volatility, sigma at 0, goes to 0. So we can also observe that the Levy case in the left upper side is included in this case. So these are the additive process that goes with implied volatility that goes to 0 at short time. On the contrary, in case 2, so for delta below minus 1/2, and also this other condition here, we have that the short time implied volatility goes to infinity. So both case 1 and case 2 are completely not acceptable for market modeling because we have a strong non-financial result. Case 3 instead, and also case 4 and 5, has a positive and finite sigma at 0. But in case 3 case, xi at 0 goes to 0, xi at t goes to 0 at short time. So the skew go to minus infinity is lower than minus 1 over the square root of t. Case 4, that is the case with beta less than 1 and delta equal to minus 1/2. Again, we have the positive implied volatility, but the skew term go to this minus square root of pi over 2. So we have a power scaling of the skew, but it cannot be calibrated because the limit does not depend from any of the model parameter. It's just this constant. So even this case is not suitable to fit market data. Finally, we have that for beta equal to 1 and delta equal to -1/2, that is, this case 5, we have a positive and finite sigma at 0 and a negative and finite c at 0. So positive at the money implied volatility and a skew that goes as -1 over the square root of t. This is synthesized in this theorem. So the additive normal temperance table has a positive and finite sigma at 0 and a negative and finite c at 0, if and only if beta is equal to 1 and delta is equal to -1/2. I just want to stress that condition 1 is equivalent to having a implied volatility that is positive and finite, and condition 2 having a skew that power scale. And this is the main result of this talk. But if you remember Roberto's talk of yesterday, this beta equal to 1 and delta equal to -1/2 were the parameters that were observed in market data. So it seems that there is a connection between market data that in some way select the parameter that allow for a positive and finite implied volatility and a skew that reflect the market skew. These are this is a result. I just want to give a brief sketch of the proof. I will not go into technicalities, just try to summarize what we have done. So we have this very useful lemma that for all admissible scaling parameter at short time, the limit of the at-the-money implied volatility, sigma at t, multiplied by the square root of t, goes to 0. Thanks to this characteristic, we can easily write the short time asymptotic of the black side of the implied volatility equation at the money, that we can see as the implied volatility multiplied by square root of t plus something that goes to 0 faster. So we understand well how the black side of the implied volatility equation behaves. If we look again at the equation, we have on the left the black side and on the right the model price. Clearly, the model price we have to deal with. We are not able to compute explicitly the expected value, but we can bound it from above and from below at short time. This allow to have the result of the theorem. So if the model price, the expected value goes to 0 faster than square root of t, we have for sure that the implied volatility should go to 0 at short time. This is case 1, the case 1 that we mentioned. On the contrary, if the model price goes to 0 slower than square root of t, for sure this implied volatility should go to infinity at short time. This is the second case. While in cases 3, 4, and 5, we have we are able to bound with relevant bound from above and from below the model price. This bound goes as the square root of t. Hence, so we can say that the limit of sigma at t to 0 is a positive constant. So we have dealt with the implied volatility. Now we just have to study the skew. Thanks to the implicit function theorem, we can obtain an expression for the skew term that, as you can see here, depends just on the money implied volatility and on an expected value of this random variable st. I just want to recall that the skew term is directly linked to the skew because the skew is the skew term over the square root of t. When the sigma of 0 is finite, but in general, we can say that we can really easily observe that the denominator is not a problem at all because it goes to a constant at short time. So we just have to study the numerator and see how it behaves for the different value of beta and delta. In case 3, we can show that the limit of c at t is 0. So the skew goes as not exactly the market observed scaling. In case 4, we see instead that the limit is this quantity minus the square root of pi over 2. And so we have this problem that I've mentioned, that we cannot calibrate this limit from market data. While in case 5, that is the beta equal to 1 and delta equal to -1/2 case, we have a negative and finite skew term that depend from the model parameters. Specifically, it depends from the eta bar, the skew term parameter. So we have a pure jump process that have finite at demand implied volatility and power scaling skew. So it's consistent with the equity market. We have this result because we were able to compute at demand implied volatility and skew for a family of additive process, and we were able to show that only beta equal to 1 and delta equal to -1/2 case are consistent with the equity market characteristic. I thank you for your time, and this is a brief sketch of the bibliography.
Thank you, Michele. Are there any questions or comments?
So one question, Michele. What about the calibration of this?
The calibration of the additive temporal stable process, or of the...
Yes. Yes.
Okay, from like in Roberto's talk, we have discussed about calibrating directly from market data. So there, the calibration was done maturity by maturity, and then for every maturity we get. If I can go back here. Okay, so for every maturity we get the skew term, this K, and the sigma term. Then we like study this behavior, and we understand that from the implied market result, this parameter, the eta, the K, appear to scale with the power law, and this power law seems to be consistent with the delta equal to -1/2 and the beta equal to 1. At this point, we studied the short time behavior and understood that this configuration of parameter allow for this kind of skew and this kind of short time implied volatility. So, like, the approach that we were using to calibrate is just calibrate from market data and then extrapolate an eta bar that should fit market data. I think that it is also possible to do the contrary. So start maybe looking at the market skew and try to infer the eta bar and the delta. Or for example, because like also maybe try to understand from the market skew even the scaling of delta, because the scaling of delta is strictly linked to the skew term. So if we take delta, if we study the behavior with respect to this delta, we can try to calibrate from the market even this delta. But I think that the most convenient approach is start from option data, because in this way we are start from calibrating directly market data, because in this way we are always sure to fit the market. Then we can use this approximation result, these short time results, to understand, to try to understand how the model behaves outside of market points. So for maturity shorter than the first maturity, if we use this kind of parameterization, we are able to have a consistent model, consistent with market prices, but also consistent with some facts that a trader or who operates in the market want to be sure that his model have. So I want to be sure that my model don't have an implied volatility that goes to 0 at short time, because, okay, maybe now there is no quoted option, so when I calibrate it, I calibrate it at 2 weeks, and I don't see the implied volatility that goes to 0. But if my model is implemented in the system, and then the times goes through, the system will think that the implied volatility goes to zero, and that is not something that should happen. The same with the skew. I want that my skew, as the time to maturity goes to zero, explode. So for this reason, being sure that the model have this characteristic is important in my point of view.
Another question, have you tried to use these models for forward starting options?
No, we haven't tried on forward starting option. This is an additive process. So in general, forward starting option are, I think, quite similar. It's like using it. You have no, I don't know if we can have something that is relevant there, because it's not, because all incremental independence.
Or
and
future
there is
research.
Yeah, for future research for sure. And now what we have done is trying to use it on futures option, and clearly there is no particular issue, but was something that was asked by the referee, so we just.
Okay.
Thank you. Other questions?
Thank you very much.
Other questions or comments? Okay, if not, we have 5 minutes, but maybe Alexander can open his. Okay. Good morning, Alexander.
Hi. Yeah, I'll try to share my screen.
Yes.
See if everything works. And that should be. Can you see it?
This is the end, yeah?
Yeah, that's the end. Yeah, that's the beginning.
Okay. Okay, maybe we wait 4 minutes, I think.
Sure. Yeah.
So 4 minutes break, and we continue. Okay, next and last speaker in this workshop is Alexander Panier from Imperial College, and he's going to talk about the big smile in multi-factor rough volatility models. So, Alexander, when you want.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to speak today. Really glad to be here. Indeed, it's a joint work with my supervisor, Antoine Jacquier, and with one of his former students, Aitor Muguruza. So it's a project that is almost finished. So hopefully we'll have the preprint online very soon. And it deals with the VIX smile in multi-factor rough volatility models, and in particular, short time asymptotics. And so it fits basically in the literature on the joint SPX VIX calibration, which has been going on for at least 15 years. And so we don't claim that we solved the problem in 30 minutes, but we hope to give a promising direction at least for the future. So let us start by motivating the problem. So usually what one wants in one's trading strategy, one wants to have some exposure to volatility as well as to the asset price. So we'd like to have a model that is consistent with both option prices on the assets, think the S&P for instance, and on volatility derivatives. And to do that, one has to choose a variance process, VET here in blue, that makes it consistent with both. And as the title suggests, we will be particularly interested in the VIX, which is a measure of the 30-day forward-looking volatility of the SPX. And it's defined as the price of a log contract. And it turns out that at least in continuous volatility models, you can rewrite it as this formula, where you basically have the integral from capital T to capital T plus delta, delta being 1 month, of the variance process VT. The VIX itself is not traded, so we're interested in VIX futures and VIX options on the futures. So I will say repeatedly VIX option, but when I say VIX option, I mean options on the VIX futures. Okay, and we will look also at the implied volatility. So just for the sake of consistency, I recall that the implied volatility is the unique non-negative solution to this equation. So this is the Black-Scholes price, and this is the observed price, which can be from the market or which can be from a given model. Okay, so the idea is how to find this process VT such that you fit both the option on the SPX and the options on the VIX. So first of all, let's just illustrate the problem. So we have two graphs here, which are clearly not real data, but they typically show what happens when you look at real data, and we'll see some market data in the end. So the first one is the very well-known SPX at the money implied volatility skew. So that is the first derivative with respect to the strike. And there is this famous blow up as time goes to zero, which has this power law, which is proportional to t to the h minus 1/2, where h is typically very small. And from this level of implied volatility, one can see that usually there is a high volatility of volatility if you want to calibrate with the SPX. On the other hand, if you look at the VIX implied volatility, you usually have this concave function with respect to the log moneyness. For fixed t, you can think of any time smaller than 6 months that you would have a similar form. And the VIX implied volatility is pretty low. And that seems contradictory to many people with the high volatility of the SPX, from the SPX. So there is a first kind of paradox here between these two stylized facts. Additionally to this slope of the SPX implied volatility, we will be chiefly interested in the first derivative of the implied volatility of the VIX, which we will call the skew, and the second derivative, which we will call the curvature. And since this is a concave function, we would like the first derivative to be positive and the second derivative to be negative. Okay, so we will try to find models that satisfy all the stylized facts, and hopefully we'll see that if it calibrates well once you get these rights. But before that, let us see some insight from people that have already tried to do that some time ago. So the idea that came from Bergomi and Gathwell were that it would be a good idea to enrich the dynamics of the variance process with an additional source of randomness. So that is not only driving it by a single Bryan motion, but by two correlated Bryan motion. So for instance, the Bergomi model, which is, sorry, I wrote in forward variance form. This is not in forward variance form, but it's usually written in forward variance form. This is the instantaneous variance, is basically the exponential of two Gaussian processes, which are in fact OU processes. And it will be important for us that here you have this exponential kernel inside the stochastic integral. So this is one of the first approaches that aimed at calibrating the VIX options. And then Gathwell proposed a double CEV model, which follows the same kind of idea. You want to have a second driving Bryan motion, so second factor. And since then, there's been a lot of new innovations. So this is, of course, a non-exhaustive list. There is a lot of new models that have been proposed. And I won't go into the details, but there's been a lot of stochastic volatility with jumps, with regime switching, and approaches which are model-free using Martingale optimal transport. So all of these approaches have their own advantages. They fit, most of them have a pretty good fit, at least for long maturities with the VIX options, but they also have their pitfalls, especially when it comes to fitting short maturities. Right, and as the title of the talk suggests, we will be interested in rough volatility, which has been notably popularized by these 4 papers. The 2 that are most important for us are the first one by Alos, Leon, and Vives, which introduced the methods that we will use in this talk. And the second one would be the one by Bayer, Fries, and Gathwell, who introduced the rough Bergomi model. So this time, the variance process is still an exponential of a Gaussian process. but it's not an OU process now, it's a RAF volatility, it's a RAF process that we will call a fractional Brownian motion. It's a bit of an abuse of language, but we will call this a fractional Brownian motion because we replace the exponential kernel by a Riemann-Liouville fractional kernel, which is singular and then blows up, and therefore this red process here is rough in the sense of having a low Holder regularity. So we'll call this process BT in red, and the exponential we will call calligraphic E for the weak exponential. Okay, so the main two advantages of rough volatility models is that they fit the roughness of the time series. That is under the historical probability. One sees that the time series of the instantaneous volatility have a lower Holder regularity than those of the standard Brownian motion, and rough volatility models capture that very well. And they also capture under the pricing measure the steepness of the SPX implied volatility skew that we just saw a couple of slides earlier. Okay, so these are the two main things, and then people have started to wonder whether it could also fit volatility derivatives as well. And there has been many promising results in that direction. I will not go into all the details, but all these papers try to combine rough volatility with the VIX and try to show that it would be a good idea to model to jointly calibrate SPX and VIX using rough volatility. So the first three look at Raff-Bergamy model and modifications of the Raff-Bergamy model. In the first one, they show actually that the Raff-Bergamy model is too close to a log normal model, even if it's not really a log normal model. But what happens if you have a log normal model, you get a flat implied volatility for the VIX, which is of course not satisfying because we saw that the skew was positive. In the second one, they add jumps to the dynamics. The third one, they add some multi-factor, some additional Brownian motion. And in the last two here, they considered modifications of the Raff-Heston model, which is another very famous rough volatility model. Okay, so they all show promising results, especially numerically. One of the drawbacks of going to rough volatility is that you lose quite a lot of analytical tractability. And therefore, in these papers, in the end, we don't have that much insight in what happens analytically to the implied volatility. So here's some very simple algebra. If you go to rough volatility, you lose Markovianity of the process. You also lose semi-martingality, which means you lose a lot of analytical tractability, both well, analytical and also numerical, to be honest. But at the same time, the methods that were developed by the paper of Lorig and Vives, which use Maliavin calculus and asymptotic analysis, remains a very efficient combo. And in fact, it's already been used in a recent paper by Lorig and Groza, where they show some small time asymptotic results for the at-the-money VIX implied volatility and its skew. And so the idea is they want to show, they want to compute the implied, this quantity, the VIX implied vol and its skew, and to show some criteria that the model has to satisfy in order for instance, for the skew to be positive, which is a stylus fact that one would like to have. And they do show that under this mixed Raff-Bergamy model, which is similar to Raff-Bergamy model, but now you have a weighted sum of two exponential. And note that the BT is a fractional Brownian motion, and it's the same fractional Brownian motion in the first and in the second exponential. And they show that this model does yield a positive skew for the VIX. So this is already very promising. Now, it seemed that it may not have been sufficient to actually capture the curvature. At least that's what numerical observations might be showing. So in this talk, we will try to go further and compute and look at multi-factor models. That is now B1 and B2 are two correlated fractional Brownian motions. And moreover, we will not only stop at the skew, but we will also compute the curvature. That is the second derivative of the implied volatility, and try to see under which conditions this curvature can be made negative, which is what we would like to have. All right, so this is all for the motivation. Now we will have one slide of quite abstract stochastic analysis, and then we will come back to more concrete results. So I need to talk about the framework that was actually introduced by this previous paper here. So the methods that were first introduced only apply to stochastic volatility models. So what one would like to do is to recover some kind of framework that looks like a stochastic volatility model. So if you want to start from a process AT, so we will be chiefly interested in a VIX, but this could be anything. This could be an average process. This can also be the stock price if you want. And we needed to have some Maillard differentiability conditions and to be FT measurable. Then you consider the Martingale MT, and using the Clark-Ohlson formula, which is a stochastic Martingale representation theorem, basically, you can recover this form of equation for MT, which now looks very much like a stochastic volatility model with multiple factors, driven by multiple Brownian motions. And the phi I here play the role of the volatility. So thanks to this formula, we recover for any kind of abstract random variable, we recover this stochastic volatility representation. And then you can unfold the methods. You can, if you define the harmonical price to be equal to be named VT, then the price decomposition formula tells you that VT can be written as the sum of two terms, one which is the exponential of the Black-Scholes price, with UT being the forward volatility, plus an extra term, which I don't write explicitly because it's a bit long, but it involves basically Maillard derivative of phi. And then the idea of the proofs, which I won't go into, but the idea of the proof then is to equate this form of the call price with the well-known form, which of the call price, where it's just the definition of the Black-Scholes formula applied at the implied volatility. So you can equate both these prices, both these quantities, apply an anticipative formula as many times as necessary, and you get something for the implied volatility and for its derivatives. Right, and so what happens is you get a sum of many terms, which are basically integrals involving Maillard derivatives. And since here we're in a very abstract setting, we make some abstract conditions for some integrals to go to zero and some others to converge to something non-trivial. And in the end, when we will define what A is, we can make some sufficient conditions which would be easier to verify. But for now, let us just look at what this framework gives us. So we define the harmonic skew, the harmonic curvature, and we get some nice asymptotic results. Okay, so let me say a few things about those. I won't go into the details of what these things are, but there are a couple of interesting things to say. What the limit of the implied volatility is the limit of the expectation of the forward volatility. That is perfectly sound. The limit of the skew can be rescaled by a t to the lambda thing, and on the right hand you have something pretty neat. So if you think, for instance, of the case of the SPX, of an asset price in the rough volatility model, lambda here would be equal to h minus 1/2, which is the famous factor that comes up in rough volatility models. And here for the curvature, one may have a different rescaling t to the gamma. And on the right-hand side, there is already the skew appearing, which means that if gamma and lambda are equal, then the skew remains in the limit. But if gamma is smaller than lambda, then the skew will vanish and go to zero. And actually, other terms might also go to zero, depending on the scaling that you choose here. Okay, so basically the right-hand side can be computed as long as you are able to compute Maillard derivatives of your model. Now let us specify what VIX is, what A is. So we say A is the VIX. we'll write it in this. So we recall that the definition is this thing. This subscript T means the conditional expectation with respect to Ft. And we'll see what happens. So far we do not explicit what the variance process is. We only explicit what A is. And we have 3 sufficient conditions, which are quite easy to satisfy on V, basically, which are basically Malevin differentiability conditions on V. And this allows us to apply the previous results. And again, we get three asymptotic results for the implied volatility, which depend only on J, where J is at the bottom and depend explicitly on the Malevin derivative of V. Then the skew, notice that the skew does not need a rescaling. That means the lambda is equal to 0. Depends on J and on G, where G depends now on the second derivative of V. And finally, the curvature is rescaled by this factor T to the 3h minus 1/2. Depends both on the first derivative of V and also the third derivative of V. Okay, so I'll let you digest a little bit. And there's one important fact to notice is this holds for h smaller than 1/6. It's interesting to notice this is the most relevant regime of rough volatility models, but this could also work with different with h bigger than 1/6. It's just that we would need a different rescaling and other terms would appear, so we'd get a different limit. But the most relevant for us would be this regime where h is smaller than 1/6. And the reason that we have a rescaling 3h minus 1/2 is because every time you apply the Malevin derivative to the variance process V, you get a kernel to the power h minus 1/2 that goes out. So 3 times that is 3h minus 3/2, and then you integrate once, so that makes it 3h minus 1/2. And that's where it comes from. Okay. So just a reminder of the models that one can consider. So this is just to remind us and just to introduce this one really. Continuous Markovian models are usually unable to fit the slope of the SPX, the Rath-Bergamy model that we saw, the mixed Rath-Bergamy model that we also saw, and we would be interested in 2-factor Rath-Bergamy model. So this time we have correlated fractional Brownian motions in the second exponential. And we can compute explicitly from this thing, we can compute explicitly what happens in the 2-factor Rath-Bergamy model. Of course, this is difficult to interpret by just looking at it. But what happens is on the right-hand side, everything is in closed form explicitly with respect to only the 5 parameters of the model. So we have chi, nu, eta, rho, and h. And delta is fixed. So this can be used as a pre-calibration tool. For instance, if you can find the range of parameters that makes the skew positive, which is possible, and the range of parameters that make the curvature negative. So if you reduce the range of the parameters, you can help speed up calibration. And it turns out that if you take rho is equal to 1, which comes back to the mixed Rath-Bergamy model that was already considered, we find that the curvature is in fact positive. So that it might be a good idea to extend it to multi-factor models. Okay, so that's it for this thing. I won't go into the details of all this interpretation, but one can actually compute it rapidly because it's all in closed form. Now for the SPX, for the skew of the SPX, you can also plug it in, and you can also get this rescaling, which is to be expected, t to the h minus 1/2. And just to summarize, so these 3 models, Heston, Bergamy, mixed Bergamy, without roughness, give a rather flat SPX skew. The Rath-Bergamy model gives a almost 0 VIX skew. The mixed Rath-Bergamy model gives a non-negative or even positive VIX curvature. And finally, the 2-factor Rath-Bergamy model gives a flexible VIX curvature and ticks actually all boxes. So this is an analytical result that backs up the implementation of this model. It's only an asymptotic result, of course, so it doesn't mean that it will fit perfectly every time, but at least it's promising for numerics. Now, we have some numerical example to show. How much time do I have left? Okay, good. We have some numerical examples to show. We haven't yet used this as a pre-calibration tool, so we haven't enforced the range of the models yet. We have only done some brute force calibration, joint calibration, which is the confidence that because of these results, we might be able to get a decent calibration. So this is yet a work to do to robustify this calibration process. So we calibrated both the SPX and the VIX at 2 completely random times. So the VIX calibration looks like this. It makes a quite impressive job, especially in the second thing here. And actually, even here at all times, there is just on the right wing that it goes a bit below for some reason here. But overall, it does a really good job at fitting the VIX. And on the same date for the SPX, it does a good job at fitting the left wing. So here the dots are market data and the dashed lines are from the model. It does a good job at fitting the right wing, the left wing, sorry, and not so much as fitting the right wing yet. Yeah, somehow the model goes back up too quickly. And on the second date, we have a similar thing. We have an extremely good calibration for the VIX and less good calibration for the SPX. Now even the left wing is a bit off as well. So it indicates that we give too much emphasis on the VIX calibration in the loss function than we do on the SPX. So this must be corrected, and hopefully we will get better results once we have corrected this and incorporated the asymptotic results that we have. And that's pretty much it for me. So thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any question, I would be happy to try and answer them.
Okay, thank you, Alexander. Are there any questions or comments?
Just one question. You say that for rough ergonomy, the skew is basically flat, but I think this has to depend on the parameters, or it is at least it is very small but positive. I don't know if you can give me some more information.
Yeah, I mean it's not equal to 0, but I think it is really close to 0 because basically, as I said, it's very close to a log normal process. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense, or?
I don't know. I think it may depend on the parameters. Okay, I think that for some set of parameters it can be very small, for sure, but it's just curiosity because basically I think that if you apply the criteria in my previous paper with Aitor and David, with the rough ergonomy, except if H is near 1/2, this has to be positive. It may be very small, obviously, but I don't know to what extent it is always very small.
Yes. Is it the case that in your papers you have a different kernel? You also have an exponential kernel multiplied by the.
Okay, I don't know. It may depend. It may depend. Okay. It may depend. It depends on what you mean very flat in comparison with others. Yeah. So no, just a curiosity, because at least I think I have to be positive.
I think it's positive, but I think in that paper what they proved was that it's not positive enough.
Yeah. So you mean that it is very close to 0?
Yeah.
Okay. Depends on the parameters. Perhaps with the same set of parameters, the mixed set, I am pretty sure that the mixed set of ergonomy has to be more greater in absolute value. I agree.
Yeah.
Okay, perhaps in comparison, yet it is really flatter. Yes, in this sense you are right.
Yes, well, I didn't say it was completely flat, but at least there was
completely flat. I think it's only in the case h equal to 1/2.
Yeah. Yes.
So
in that case, it's
the rough component introduces a positive skew at itself.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but okay.
Indeed.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, other questions? No more questions, nor comments? No hands. Yeah, Raul.
Raul has a question.
I see. Raul. What do you want? Raul? Raul? Do you hear us?
I think we do not hear
hello,
you, Raul.
Yeah, Raul, your time.
In the case of the two-factor overcoming, can you tell us which cost parameters have you used to fit the data? Because I was not able to see it.
No, that's because I didn't show them. Okay, so we have different parameters that came up. In the first one, so in this one, gamma is around, well, actually I can't show you, but I can read them to you. So gamma is around 0.55, nu is 134, eta is 3.3, h is 0.13, and then we have also all the correlation parameters. Is there one that you want to know in particular?
The Hurst parameter of the two.
So in this, in this first date, h is around 0.14. Yeah, for this first date, and for the second date, I think it's actually bigger, which I found surprising. It's 0.2 in the second one. So I think that if we can enforce the Hurst parameter by fitting with the SPX first, well, that might speed up calibration first, and we know that if we want to fit the slope of the SPX for implied vol, we need it to be smaller than what it is. So probably if we fix it beforehand, it should improve the SPX calibration.
So B1 and B2 have the same Hurst parameter?
Yes. What do you mean by V1 and B1 and B2 have the same Hurst parameter?
Have you tried to have two different Hurst parameters?
We haven't tried, but that might be a good idea.
Because maybe with one has a lot of skew and a Hurst parameter that is very low, and the other is something a little bit more similar to Markovian one for the long range and the other for the short range. So maybe that gives you a little bit more of flexibility, and you get the properties of the overcoming on the short time scale, and you get the Brownian motion properties on the long range scale.
That's true.
So maybe you can get a mix that it's a little bit more interesting.
Yeah, we'll try to do that.
Okay. Thank you. More questions or comments? Dario? No?
No question. Okay, one question, but to you and not to Alexandre. What about official closure of the conference?
No, now I'm going to talk about this, to officially close the workshop.
Okay, should I stop
so
sharing?
If there are no more questions. Raul, no questions, because your hand is still okay. So this is the end of this workshop on new challenges in quantitative finance, inscribed in this intensive research program in the CRM. In fact, the intensive research program continues 1 week more, but no, with not collective activities. So first of all, thank you very much to all speakers. Maybe we can do a clap to all speakers all the week. Okay. And also thank you to everybody for coming, virtually coming. And okay, if someone wants to make some comments, I don't know, maybe Elisa, maybe Darius, others.
I've got one. So I think virtual workshops, to my great surprise, have sense. So of course, meeting you in person would be much more valuable, but it has some value to meet you, say, on wires. And
okay,
to my surprise, so I didn't expect that interesting conference.
Thank you. I think it has been also. I think it has been very, very interesting. Yes, I agree with you. Other comments?
Yes, thank you very much, Darius, for your work. You know that we have been organizing this school during nearly 2 years, and it was very sad for us to decide at the end to do it online. But I think it has been successful with very nice talks and with a lot of interest from all the attendants and with a lot of help from our sponsors and from the CRM and all people that has been in the organization of the event. So I only have to say thanks to everyone. It has been better than I expected, really, and this is because of the work of all people that has been involved. So thanks a lot to everyone.
Okay, yeah, many people is saying thanks and congrats for the workshop. Thank you, everybody, for your participation and your comments. Maybe you, Elisa, that are the main organizer of the workshop and the intensive research program, you can say the last words.
Okay, I think I said everything. So the most I wanted to say is thanks to everyone, because this has been difficult times. So, but people is here and here doing something very different from what we had in mind at the beginning. And people have been here participating, discussing, and this has been a very nice experience. So the only thing I have to say is thanks to everybody. And I really hope to see you in 3 dimensions early.
Yes, that's what's missing, that dimension.
That's okay. That's all from my side. Thank you very much to everyone.
Okay, so we close.
Okay, so thank you. And I press the red button.
Okay. I will do the same. Bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.